Welcome, weary traveler. You've left the noise of the world behind and stepped into a realm untouched by time. Here, candlelight dances upon ancient stone walls, and the air carries the soft hum of forgotten lullabies. Beyond these gates, the night is gentle, and every story is a silver thread, weaving warmth around your heart. So rest your mind. Let each word be a quiet step into the halls of dreams until sleep, tender and deep, finds you. You are safe here, and the world drifts away. Chapter 1: The Castle at Sunset. The sun was lowering behind the hills, spilling its last golden light across the wide valley of the kingdom. The light seemed softer here, as though it had learned to bend and linger in kindness before it left. The castle, standing high upon its rise, caught the glow along its stone walls, turning them into a pale honey color. Its tall windows glimmered with reflections of the sun's farewell, and the banners on the turrets drifted in the soft evening air. Below, the village was settling into its gentle rhythm, as it did every night, carrying with it the sounds of winding down, of life folding itself into comfort. Fred, a young stable hand, leaned against the wooden fence near the pasture. His day had been filled with brushing the coats of the horses and making sure their stalls were clean, but now he let himself rest. The air was cool against his skin, the faint smell of hay and warm earth drifting upward. The horses shifted lazily in the fading light, their long tails flicking gently, their ears twitching toward the evening sounds. Fred watched them with a quiet fondness, his body calm, his breathing unhurried. From the castle, Lady Katherine walked the stone balcony that overlooked the village and fields. Her gown shimmered faintly in the fading light, not with jewels or gold, but with the softness of linen dyed the color of deep wine. She held her hands lightly before her, her pace slow, as though she wished to gather each moment of the evening and hold it close. The sunset painted her face with warmth, and she closed her eyes for a breath, listening to the hush that spread across the land. Antonio, the old steward of the castle, was at the far end of the courtyard, tending the last of the lamps. His hands were steady, practiced from years of care, as he lit the flame within each glass lantern. One by one, the lanterns awoke, their small lights glowing like stars fallen to earth. Each flame brought a sense of calm to the stone courtyard, guiding the way for any who might pass in the night. Antonio moved slowly, reverently, his mind already slipping into the quiet of evening. From the village below came the faint sound of laughter as children were called inside by their mothers. The last baskets of bread were being carried home, and shutters were drawn gently against the cooling air. Smoke rose from chimneys in thin curls, carrying the promise of warm suppers and firelight within. The streets were not busy now, but calm, every step purposeful, every voice softened. Fred left the pasture and made his way down the cobbled path toward the village square. He carried with him a small lantern, its flame swaying gently as he walked. He liked the feeling of being part of the slow rhythm, of bringing light into the darkening corners. He passed by the bakery, where the last loaves cooled upon wooden racks, the smell rich and comforting. He passed the inn, where a lute was being tuned for the evening, its gentle notes drifting like threads of silk through the air. Lady Katherine left the balcony after some time and walked through the castle halls. The corridors were hushed, their tall arches echoing only her soft steps. The walls were lined with tapestries that told stories of peace, of harvests and gardens, of feasts where no one was hungry. She touched the edge of one tapestry gently, the fabric soft beneath her fingertips, and smiled at the thought of her people resting content in their homes. Antonio finished his work in the courtyard and leaned his staff against the stone wall. He looked up at the sky, now deepening into violet, the first stars appearing like faint sparks. He remembered how many nights he had seen just like this, and how each one seemed to carry the same message. All is well, all is safe. The old steward let his shoulders relax, his body at ease, and he listened for the brook that wound its way through the valley, its song always steady, always kind. In the meadow beyond the village, the grasses swayed under the touch of the evening breeze. Fireflies began to glow here and there, their faint lights rising and falling like gentle breaths. The brook's waters reflected the sky, a ribbon of silver cutting softly through the land. The whole kingdom seemed wrapped in a single hush, as though the very earth had chosen to exhale with peace. Fred reached the square and placed his lantern upon the edge of the fountain. The water caught the glow, sending ripples of gold across the stone. He sat upon the fountain's rim, stretching his legs, listening to the sound of trickling water. Villagers passed by with nods and smiles, their faces lit by the lanterns. The square was no longer a place of trade or noise, but a place of gathering calm, where neighbors greeted one another softly before returning to their homes. Lady Katherine, from her chamber window, gazed once more across the valley. She could see the lights of the village flickering to life, tiny stars that mirrored the heavens. She rested her chin lightly in her hand, her breath deep and slow. There was no hurry in her, no demand, only the pleasure of knowing that peace filled her lands. The thought soothed her like a lullaby. Antonio, making his way back to his small chamber, hummed an old song beneath his breath. It was not a song of war or triumph, but one of harvest, of bread and wine, of children growing strong under safe skies. His voice was low, steady, like the purring of a cat before a fire. The sound lingered in the corridor even after he had passed, blending with the silence until it became part of the stone itself. The moon rose above the hills, pale and steady, casting silver light across rooftops and fields. The kingdom glowed under its touch, every blade of grass tipped with light, every stream glistening faintly. The night had come, not suddenly, but tenderly, like a blanket being drawn across the land. Fred closed his eyes at the fountain, listening to the music of the square, the water, the lute's gentle strumming, the faint murmur of voices. Katherine drifted to her bedchamber, where candles burned low and curtains swayed in the cool air. Antonio lay upon his cot, his hands folded upon his chest, his breathing deep, his heart steady. The kingdom dreamed together, though its people were awake still. It dreamed in the rustling leaves, in the soft glow of lanterns, in the hush of voices speaking kindly. And as the first deep shadows of night folded over the land, the Golden Kingdom seemed to whisper a promise, that here there would always be peace, that here sleep would always come gently, that here no dream need be troubled, for the night itself would hold them. And so the kingdom settled deeper into its evening calm, the stars above keeping watch, the moon guarding the silence, while every heart beat in unison with rest. Chapter 2. The Whispering Brook. The morning broke gently over the Golden Kingdom. Dawn arrived not with noise, but with a quiet unveiling, as though the sky itself stretched awake. The mist lay low upon the meadows, drifting in pale veils of silver. Birds began their songs one by one, their calls weaving together into a soft chorus. The brook that ran through the valley carried the music of water, trickling and flowing over smooth stones, its voice as steady as breathing. Fred stirred in the stable yard as the first rays touched the rooftops. His blanket had slipped from his shoulder during the night, but the air was not biting, only cool and fresh. He rose slowly, brushing the straw from his tunic, and looked toward the pasture. The horses were already awake, lifting their heads, ears twitching at the new day. Their breath curled in faint clouds, vanishing into the mist. Fred smiled, for there was always something reassuring in the way the animals trusted the morning. They did not question whether light would come. They simply waited, and it did. From the high window of her chamber, Lady Katherine gazed out upon the awakening land. She had slept well, her dreams filled with gentle images, fields of gold, rivers glimmering like ribbons, skies wide and calm. She stretched her arms, the long sleeves of her gown trailing as she did, and felt the hush of the morning enter her chest. Her heart beat evenly, matched to the rhythm of the day's beginning. Antonio, the steward, had risen even earlier. He had walked the courtyard when it was still wrapped in shadow, his lantern flickering with its last flame before the sun chased it away. He enjoyed these quiet hours, when the castle was hushed and even the air seemed half asleep. His old steps carried him along the stone walls, pausing at places where ivy curled, or where dew gathered like crystal beads upon the stone. He always liked to see the castle not as a fortress, but as a home, an old friend that needed steady care. By the time the sun broke fully above the hills, villagers had begun their day. Smoke rose from chimneys once more, this time carrying the warm scent of porridge and baking bread. Carts creaked along the cobbled paths as farmers made their way to the fields. Children's voices rang out, chasing each other along the lanes before being called back by gentle mothers. Everything unfolded with ease, as though the kingdom had no rush, no burden. Fred carried a pail of water from the brook to the stables. He walked slowly, the weight of the pail swinging against his leg, but he did not mind. He liked the brook best in the mornings, when its surface was lit with gold and the mist hovered above it. It always seemed to whisper as he passed, the sound of water slipping over stones forming words he almost understood. Sometimes he thought it was telling him secrets, not of danger, but of peace, as though the brook itself promised to keep the kingdom safe. Lady Katherine dressed simply for the morning, choosing a gown of soft green, the color of the meadows after rain. She wore no jewels, only a single braid in her hair, tied with a ribbon the color of cream. She preferred these mornings when she could walk the gardens without ceremony. Her slippers pressed softly upon the dew-wet grass as she moved among the hedges and roses. She touched each leaf as though greeting it, pausing to inhale the gentle fragrance of the blossoms. The bees were already awake, their hum like a quiet hymn to the day. Antonio met her in the garden, his staff tapping lightly upon the path. His old eyes brightened at the sight of her, for he had watched her grow from a child into the lady of the castle, and he always found peace in her calm presence. "You rise with the flowers, my lady," he said, bowing slightly, though not stiffly. "And you rise before even they open," Katherine answered, her voice soft. They both smiled, the silence between them friendly and unforced. The two walked together to the fountain at the center of the garden. The water there leapt lightly, sparkling in the morning sun. Katherine sat upon the stone rim, her hands folded in her lap, while Antonio stood nearby, leaning gently upon his staff. They watched the water in quiet, letting its steady sound fill the air between words. It was Antonio who spoke at last. "This brook, this fountain, they have seen more years than I, and yet they always speak the same way. Steady, calm, unchanged. Katherine nodded. Perhaps that is their gift, to remind us that peace does not need to change. Meanwhile, Fred had finished his work in the stables and now carried a small basket of apples down to the brook. He liked to sit by the water when his tasks were done, eating slowly, letting the cool air brush against his face. Today, as he sat upon the bank, he noticed how the current bent around the stones, weaving and circling, as though the water were dancing. He dropped one of the apples into the brook, watching as it floated away, bobbing gently, carried toward the fields below. He wondered if someone far away would find it and smile. The thought pleased him. In the village square, the market had begun to stir. Stalls were being set up with cloths, baskets of vegetables, jars of honey, and loaves of bread still steaming. The baker's wife arranged the loaves with care, patting them as though they were her children. The blacksmith's hammer rang out in a steady rhythm, not harsh, but strong, like a heartbeat of the kingdom itself. Children darted between the stalls, their laughter echoing against the stone walls. Lady Katherine soon left the garden and made her way down to the village, Antonio walking at her side. She liked to be among her people, to hear their voices, to share their mornings. As she entered the square, the villagers bowed their heads respectfully, but there was no stiffness in their movements. Their lady was not distant from them, but close, like a sister or friend. She smiled warmly, asking after families, after harvests, after small joys. Each word she spoke was soft, as though woven from kindness itself. Fred, carrying his empty basket, arrived in the square at the same time. He greeted Katherine with a quiet nod, his eyes respectful but unafraid. She remembered him from the stables, the boy with steady hands who treated horses as though they were noble lords themselves. Their eyes met only briefly, but there was a silent understanding there. Both carried the same peace within them, drawn from the same land, the same morning air. The market continued with its soft rhythm, voices rising and falling like the tide. The brook wound its way nearby, its voice mingling with the laughter and greetings, as though it too were part of the gathering. Antonio leaned upon his staff and watched the scene, his heart content. He thought to himself that peace was not always in grand things. Sometimes it was in the simplest mornings, in the whispers of water, in the kindness of neighbors. As the sun climbed higher, the mist lifted from the fields. The golden light spilled across every roof, every tree, every blade of grass. The kingdom seemed to glow as though it held the sun within itself. And in that glow, life unfolded without hurry, without fear, without shadow. By the time noon came, the brook still whispered, the villagers still smiled, the horses still grazed, and the castle still stood watching over it all. And as Katherine, Fred, and Antonio returned to their places, each carried with them the same truth, that peace was not something they sought. Chapter 3, Lanterns in the Evening. The day had unfolded like a gentle tapestry, every thread woven with quiet ease. Now the sun drifted lower toward the horizon, spreading its golden light over the fields and rooftops. Shadows lengthened but carried no menace, only a sense of rest, as though the land itself sighed with contentment. The breeze that moved through the valley was tender, carrying the scent of hay, bread, and blossoms. It was the kind of evening that asked for stillness, for the slow drawing of lanterns, and for voices softened into laughter. Lady Katherine sat in the castle's west tower, her window open to the falling light. She leaned upon the stone ledge, her chin resting in her palm, and let the air move through her hair. From here, she could see the village preparing for the night's small gathering. It was a tradition held not out of necessity but out of affection, for the people loved to gather when the day was done, to share warmth before retreating into their homes. Katherine always found it calming to watch. She thought of the kingdom not as a domain to rule, but as a living hearth, glowing with countless sparks of human kindness. In the courtyard below, Fred was finishing his evening tasks. He had brushed down the horses, filled their troughs with fresh water, and now carried a bundle of hay to the last stall. The animals were calm, tails swishing lazily, their bodies settling into the rhythm of the night. Fred hummed under his breath, a tune he did not know the origin of, but one that rose easily whenever he felt content. The sound blended with the creak of wood and the faint clip of hooves upon stone. Antonio, the steward, walked the same courtyard, his staff steady upon the flagstones. He paused often, not because he lacked strength, but because he loved to see each corner of the castle as the sun dipped behind the hills. He checked the gates, touched the ivy on the walls, and murmured to himself as though the castle listened. "Another day, old friend," he said softly, patting the wall. "And another evening to be thankful." By the time the sky deepened into shades of amber and rose, villagers had begun to gather near the square. Small lanterns were lit, their flames flickering against the dusk. Some were hung from posts, others from tree branches, and many were carried in hands. The light spread like stars descending upon the earth, soft and golden, warming the cobblestones beneath them. The brook beside the village reflected the lanterns, carrying their glow upon its ripples, so that it seemed the water itself held tiny sparks of fire. Katherine left her chamber and walked slowly toward the village, her green gown brushing lightly against the ground. She wore a shawl around her shoulders, woven of pale wool, and her steps were unhurried. Fred, finished with his work, followed a little later, hands empty now, free of burden. Antonio was already in the square, standing near the fountain, greeting villagers with his familiar nods and words of kindness. The gathering was not a festival in the grand sense. There were no trumpets or banners, no urgency in the music. Instead, there was the soft sound of fiddles and flutes, played by villagers who knew the tunes by heart. Children clapped their hands, circling one another in dances that were half play, half ritual. Parents stood nearby, smiling, sometimes swaying with the rhythm. The smell of roasted chestnuts and fresh bread filled the air, mingling with the faint smoke of lantern oil. Fred stood by the brook, leaning against the wooden rail, watching the lanterns float upon the surface. The villagers had begun setting small candlelit boats upon the water, letting them drift downstream. Each flame was steady, glowing warmly against the darkening sky. Fred lowered his head, letting the sight ease him. He thought of how the brook carried these lights as though it carried their hopes, their dreams, gently, without haste. Katherine soon joined him, her eyes also upon the water. She stood beside him in silence for a long while before speaking. "They look like stars," she said, her voice hushed. "Only closer," Fred answered softly. "Close enough to touch." Their words fell like feathers, light and unforced, and then silence returned, filled only by the brook's murmur. Antonio, meanwhile, was seated upon a wooden bench, his staff resting across his knees. Children gathered near him, asking him for stories, as they always did. He smiled, his wrinkled face glowing in the lantern light, and began to speak. His voice was low, soothing, as though it came from the earth itself. He told them not of battles or dangers, but of fields that grew golden under the sun, of rivers that remembered every footstep that touched their banks, and of stars that listened when children wished. The little ones leaned against him, their eyelids heavy, lulled not only by the story but by the warmth of the evening. The music drifted on. Couples began to dance slowly, their movements simple, their steps unhurried. Lanterns swayed in the breeze, sending their light across faces calm and smiling. Katherine watched from the brook's edge, her heart swelling with quiet gratitude. She thought that peace was not merely the absence of trouble. It was this: neighbors gathering without fear, voices rising without strain, children laughing without care. Fred, shy at first, was drawn into a small circle dance by the younger villagers. He moved awkwardly at first, but the laughter was kind, and soon he was smiling, his steps light against the stones. Katherine laughed softly to see him, a sound like bells carried upon the wind. For a moment, all burdens, all thoughts of duties and tasks, seemed far away. As the evening deepened, the villagers began to tire. Children dozed in their parents' arms, the music slowed, and the lanterns grew brighter against the dark. The brook still carried its tiny flames, winding them gently out of sight. Antonio rose from his bench, his back a little stiff, but his spirit light. Katherine offered him her arm, and together with Fred they began the slow walk back to the castle. The path was lined with lanterns, each one swaying in the soft breeze. Their glow followed the three companions as they climbed the gentle slope. No words were spoken. There was no need. The silence was not empty, but full of warmth, of contentment, of unspoken gratitude. When they reached the castle gates, Katherine turned back once more to the village. From this height, the lanterns below looked like a cluster of golden fireflies, gathered close together in the night. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "The kingdom dreams even before sleep." Fred heard her words and carried them quietly within. Antonio smiled faintly, his hand resting upon the stone wall of the castle. And as they entered through the gates, the lantern light followed them in memory, settling upon their hearts like a lullaby. The night had come fully now, the sky velvet dark, the stars watching overhead. But there was no heaviness in the kingdom, only rest, only calm. The lanterns still whispered along the brook, the castle stood in quiet grace, and the people slept with peace folded around them like a blanket. And so the golden kingdom breathed into its evening, steady and serene, awaiting another dawn. Chapter 4. A Walk Beneath the Moon. The moon rose quietly above the horizon, silver and steady, as though it had always been waiting for the evening to arrive. Its light spilled across the valley, softening every edge, turning rooftops into shapes of pearl and shadow. The brook shimmered beneath it, carrying long ribbons of silver that wound past the village and into the meadows. It was not a bright moon, not overwhelming, but gentle, like the flame of a single candle in a large, darkened room. Katherine stood by her window in the west tower, the shawl she had worn earlier still wrapped across her shoulders. She breathed in the night air, cool and faintly perfumed by the last blossoms of summer. Her heart stirred, not with worry, but with a longing for quiet companionship beneath the stars. There were moments, she thought, when one must step outside the castle walls to feel the world more closely. Tonight was such a night, She descended the spiral stairs softly, her footsteps slow against the worn stone. In the courtyard, she found Fred, just finishing with the last of his duties. He was adjusting the latch on the stable door, careful to ensure the horses were safe for the night. Hearing her approach, he turned, surprised, then smiled. "You're not often in the courtyard at this hour, my lady," he said, his voice low, respectful but warm. "No," Katherine replied gently, "but the moon calls for a walk. Would you join me, Fred?" His eyes brightened, and he nodded without hesitation. "Gladly." As they passed through the castle gates, Antonio was there, leaning upon his staff as though expecting them. His eyes, wise and kind, reflected the moonlight. "A fine night for wandering," he murmured. "I will walk with you a while, if you permit." "Of course," Katherine said softly. "The more the merrier." And so the three of them set out along the path that wound between the castle and the village, their steps unhurried, their words few. The night itself seemed to speak more clearly than conversation. The rustle of leaves in the trees, the quiet chirping of crickets, the soft whisper of wind brushing across grass. They came first to the meadow, where the moonlight spread like a silver blanket across the earth. Each blade of grass glistened with dew, each wildflower closed its petals to rest. Fireflies drifted lazily, their glow faint, as if they too were subdued by the stillness. Katherine paused, letting the quiet soak into her. "It feels," she whispered, "as though the meadow itself is asleep, dreaming beneath the moon." Fred nodded, gazing across the rolling field. "And we are the dreamers within the dream." Antonio chuckled softly, the sound low and fond. "You see the truth of things, lad. Nights such as this remind us that we are but small parts of a vast, gentle whole." They continued toward the forest that edged the meadow. The trees rose tall and dark, but their branches let the moonlight filter through, so that the path glowed faintly, guiding them forward. The air here was cooler, touched with the earthy scent of moss and bark. An owl called once in the distance, its voice steady, not alarming, but like a watchman reminding the world of its rhythms. Inside the forest, their footsteps softened, cushioned by pine needles and leaves. The stillness was deeper here, yet it was not heavy. It was the stillness of protection, of being enclosed in a quiet embrace. Katherine reached out to touch the rough bark of an oak tree, feeling its strength steady beneath her hand. She thought of how many years it had stood, and how many nights like this it had witnessed. Antonio spoke again, his voice carrying the rhythm of memory. "When I was a boy, I often walked these woods at night. My mother told me that the trees were keepers of dreams, that if you leaned your ear close, you might hear them whisper what they had seen." Fred tilted his head with a half-smile. "Do you believe they truly whisper, Master Antonio?" The steward's eyes gleamed with the kind of faith that is not easily shaken. "I believe they do, perhaps not in words we understand, but in the rustle of their leaves, in the creak of their trunks. They hold the dreams of the kingdom, whether we hear them or not." They walked on, listening more closely now. Indeed, the wind stirred the branches above, and the sound seemed like voices woven together, gentle, endless, never hurried. Katherine closed her eyes a moment, letting the sound wash through her. It was as though the forest carried not only the kingdom's dreams, but its peace, its hopes, and its quiet joys. After a time, they came to a clearing where the moonlight fell full and bright. The grass here was soft, almost glowing under the silver light. At its center stood a stone, weathered and smooth, as though placed there by ancient hands. The three companions sat upon the grass near it, forming a small circle in the moonlit glade. Fred leaned back, resting on his elbows, gazing up at the stars. "It feels," he said softly, "like the sky is closer here, as though we could reach up and touch the stars themselves." Katherine followed his gaze. The heavens were indeed vivid tonight, each star sharp against the velvet dark. She let her breath slow, her body relaxing into the earth beneath her. "Perhaps," she murmured, "the stars lean closer when they know we are watching." Antonio chuckled again, closing his eyes. "A comforting thought, my lady, and I would not be surprised if it were true." They sat in companionable silence for a long time. No need for stories, no need for plans. Only the presence of moonlight, the murmur of trees, the soft breath of the earth. The silence was not empty, but full, like a cup brimming with peace. When at last they rose, it was with unhurried movements, as though waking from a gentle dream. They followed the path back through the forest, the moon guiding their way. The meadow lay waiting, silver and still, the fireflies now gone to rest. Beyond, the village lanterns glowed faintly, like a cluster of stars fallen upon the ground. As they neared the castle, Katherine paused at the gates, turning once more to gaze upon the valley. The moonlight touched everything: the cottages, the brook, the fields, and it seemed to her as though the whole kingdom were gathered into one gentle embrace. "Tonight," she said softly, "the Golden Kingdom dreams with us." Fred and Antonio bowed their heads slightly, in agreement not of duty, but of shared feeling. Together, they stepped inside the gates, the night settling softly behind them. Within the castle, all was still. The torches burned low, the halls hushed. Katherine returned to her chamber, Fred to his quarters, Antonio to his modest room. Each lay down to rest, carrying the memory of the moonlit walk within them. And as they drifted into sleep, the kingdom itself seemed to sigh contentedly, as though it too was falling into dreams. Chapter 5: The Golden Dawn. Morning in the Golden Kingdom did not arrive with haste. It unfolded gently, like a song played on a harp, each note soft and lingering. The first light touched the horizon in hues of rose and amber, spreading tenderly across the fields. The mist that had lingered through the night began to lift, curling upward in pale ribbons that shimmered before dissolving into the air. Within the castle, the night's silence gave way to faint stirrings. The servants moved quietly through the halls, tending to their duties with care, their steps muffled by the woven rugs that lined the stone floors. From the kitchens drifted the first warm scents of bread baking, a fragrance that always carried with it a sense of comfort and promise. Katherine rose early, as was her custom, though she did not rush. She stretched slowly in her bed, listening to the muffled sounds of life returning to the castle. Beyond her window, the light strengthened, spilling over the hills, painting the village rooftops with pale gold. She breathed deeply, feeling the stillness of the morning settle within her chest before she began her day. She dressed in a gown of soft blue, simple yet graceful, and wrapped a golden clasp at her shoulder to hold her shawl in place. For a while, she stood at the window, watching as the village below began to wake. Smoke rose from chimneys in slender curls, and she could see figures moving about. Bakers carrying trays, children skipping down lanes, farmers leading oxen toward the fields. The rhythm of life had begun again, steady and assured. Fred, meanwhile, was already in the courtyard, brushing down one of the castle horses. His movements were slow and patient, his hand moving along the animal's neck with gentle strokes. He hummed softly as he worked, not a song with words, but a melody born of contentment. The horse's ears twitched, its body leaning into his touch as though sharing in the peace of the moment. Antonio emerged soon after, carrying a ledger tucked under his arm. He was not hurried, he never was, but his presence carried a quiet purpose. He paused in the courtyard, watching Fred with the horse, and allowed himself a small smile. Even the beasts of the kingdom seem to rest easier when the dawn comes golden, he remarked. Fred looked up and nodded. It feels like the whole land is breathing, Master Antonio. Breathing in the morning, breathing out the night. The steward inclined his head thoughtfully, his eyes lifting toward the sky, where the sun was climbing higher, its rays soft and warming. Yes, and it is in that breath we find our place. The three of them, Katherine, Fred, and Antonio, met not long after in the garden. The roses glistened with dew, their petals shining in the morning light. Bees moved lazily from bloom to bloom, already awake to the day's work. The brook at the garden's edge whispered quietly, carrying the light along its ripples like strands of gold. They walked together among the flowers, their steps unhurried, their conversation gentle. Katherine leaned down to touch a blossom, her fingers brushing the damp petals. "It feels like the earth is smiling," she said softly. Fred, carrying a small basket for the morning harvest, nodded. "And we are part of its smile." Antonio placed a hand upon the stone wall that bordered the garden, feeling its warmth as the sun reached it. The kingdom thrives not because of walls or swords, but because we pause to notice mornings such as this. Peace grows where it is honored. They lingered there for some time, watching as the village continued to stir. A group of children passed along the lane below the castle, their laughter carrying upward, clear and bright. Farmers walked with baskets slung over their shoulders, exchanging greetings as they set off toward the fields. Every sound was part of a larger harmony, a music that belonged only to the kingdom when it rested in peace. Later, they made their way down toward the village square. The fountain sparkled under the morning light, its waters catching the sun like liquid gold. Merchants began to arrange their wares, fresh fruits, woven cloth, jars of honey that glistened amber in glass. The market was not yet busy, but its slow awakening held a charm of its own. Katherine paused near the fountain, her hand resting lightly upon its cool stone. "I love this hour," she murmured, "when the day is young, and every voice, every sound feels like the beginning of a story." Fred set his basket down beside her, gazing into the clear water. "It's as if the whole village is whispering the same tale, one of peace, one of gentle hours." Antonio stood beside them, nodding slowly. The kingdom breathes together. That is its strength. As the morning unfolded, they visited familiar places. The bakery, where loaves of bread cooled on wooden shelves. The tailor's, where cloth of deep blues and warm reds hung in neat rows. The apothecary, where herbs hung from rafters, their fragrance rich and calming. Everywhere they went, they were greeted not with ceremony, but with warmth. The people bowed their heads gently, offering smiles rather than grand gestures. By midday, the sun stood high, its light spreading evenly across the land. The village hummed with quiet industry, yet nothing felt rushed. Even the busiest hands moved with a rhythm that seemed to honor the calm of the day. Katherine, Fred, and Antonio returned to the castle gardens for a simple meal. A loaf of bread, a wheel of cheese, fruit from the orchard. They sat upon the grass, sharing food and laughter, their words flowing as easily as the brook beside them. Chapter 6, Whispers of Twilight. The afternoon slipped away without resistance, as though the hours themselves wished to rest. The sun, steady and warm, began its slow descent, leaning closer to the horizon with each passing breath of the breeze. Its light softened into a golden haze, draping the hills in warmth and shadow. In the castle gardens, the roses began to fold their petals for the evening, and the bees, weary from their day's work, disappeared into hives hidden in the hedges. The brook, still glimmering with sunlight, carried its gentle voice across the quiet fields. The kingdom moved toward twilight, not hurried, but drifting, like a lullaby. Katherine sat upon a stone bench by the garden wall, her hands folded loosely in her lap. She had set aside her shawl, for the evening air was mild, carrying the faintest scent of lavender from the village below. Her eyes traced the slow movement of the sun, its fading brilliance mirrored in the still waters of the fountain nearby. There was no need for words, only the rhythm of the earth closing its day. Fred was nearby, leaning against the wall with a sprig of rosemary between his fingers. He twirled it absently, lifting it now and then to breathe in its clean fragrance. His gaze wandered across the meadow, where the sheep grazed untroubled, their soft bleats echoing faintly. "Twilight makes everything seem softer," he said at last, his voice low and unhurried. "Even the stones of the castle look gentler now." Katherine turned her head to him, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Yes, as though the whole world exhales when the day is done." Antonio approached quietly, his steps soundless against the grass. He carried a small book bound in leather, its cover worn from years of careful handling. Without speaking at first, he lowered himself onto the bench beside Katherine. For a while, he too watched the light change, his features calm, softened by the hues of the evening. When he finally spoke, his voice was like the murmur of the brook. "This hour is a gift, a bridge between what has been and what is to come." The three sat together in companionable silence, the stillness between them filled not with emptiness, but with presence. The village below had quieted too, its earlier bustle slowing to a hush. Families gathered around tables, smoke rose gently from hearths, and lanterns flickered one by one along the lanes. The kingdom seemed wrapped in a blanket of calm. As the first star appeared in the dimming sky, Katherine let out a sigh, long and contented. "It feels as if the heavens are keeping watch, one star at a time." Fred tilted his head back, following the faint spark that twinkled above. "Perhaps they are. Perhaps each star is a lantern hung by someone long before us, to guide the night gently onward." Antonio turned a page in his book, though he did not read aloud yet. His voice, thoughtful and measured, joined theirs. "Stories such as that keep us close to wonder, and wonder, in turn, keeps the heart restful." When the sun finally slipped beyond the horizon, the sky deepened into shades of violet and indigo. The moon rose, round and steady, casting a silver glow across the kingdom. The brook caught the moonlight now instead of the sun, its ripples reflecting like scattered pearls. The three companions rose from the bench and began a slow walk along the garden path. Fireflies emerged among the hedges, their golden sparks drifting lazily in the air. Each flicker seemed like a heartbeat of the night itself, soft and steady. Fred chuckled lightly, reaching out a hand as one of the fireflies hovered near him. "Little keepers of the dark," he murmured. Katherine walked beside him, her gaze following the gentle dance of the lights. "They remind me of candles," she said. "Candles lit by invisible hands to bless the night." Antonio, closing his book, clasped it to his chest as he walked. "Every small light has its place," he observed, "and together, They weave comfort into the shadows. Their steps carried them back toward the castle, where torches had been lit along the walls, their flames steady but quiet. The air carried with it the mingled sense of earth and smoke, sharpened slightly by the coolness of the growing night. Servants moved softly, carrying trays and lanterns, their voices hushed so as not to disturb the tranquility that had settled over the kingdom. Inside the castle hall, the long tables were already set for the evening meal. Platters of roasted vegetables, bowls of broth, loaves of warm bread, and pitchers of cool water awaited. The company that gathered was not grand, but modest and dear. Guards setting aside their arms, servants joining without hesitation, and elders from the village welcomed with easy grace. Katherine, Fred, and Antonio found their places among them, not raised above, but seated close, sharing the same bread, the same warmth. Conversation flowed, but never pressed. It rose and fell like the murmur of waves. Laughter mingled with quiet words, all carried by the glow of torches and the soft flicker of candles. Fred broke bread and passed it to Katherine, who smiled in thanks before offering it onward to Antonio. Antonio in turn poured wine into their cups, his movements careful, his face serene. In the sharing, there was a kind of sacredness, unspoken but deeply felt. After the meal, music began, not loud or urgent, but a single lute strummed gently by a young minstrel near the hearth. The notes floated into the hall like drifting feathers, settling in the hearts of all who listened. Some hummed softly, others leaned against one another with eyes half closed, letting the music carry them deeper into rest. Katherine closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the tune as though it were woven into the very air. Fred leaned forward, his chin resting on his folded hands, while Antonio's fingers tapped lightly against the edge of his cup in rhythm. Time slipped unnoticed as twilight deepened into night. The hall grew quieter, the fire lowering to glowing embers. One by one, the company rose and drifted away, seeking their chambers, their voices fading into the stillness. At last, Katherine, Fred, and Antonio stepped out into the courtyard once more. The moon was high now, casting its silver light over stone and meadow alike. The air was cool, carrying the faintest rustle of leaves. Katherine drew her shawl around her shoulders, though not against cold, but as a gesture of comfort. "The day has closed like a book," she said softly, "and the night opens its own pages." Fred looked upward, his face illuminated by the moon. "And what stories will the stars tell us tonight?" Antonio stood quietly between them, his expression gentle, his presence steady. Stories without hurry. Stories meant not to be finished, but simply lived. They lingered there until the stillness deepened even further, until the world seemed to breathe only in whispers. Then, at last, they returned within, each step slow, each heart soothed, each thought dissolving into the quiet of the night. The kingdom slept, and in its dreams, peace reigned as surely as the moonlight upon its golden stones. Chapter 7. The Midnight Courtyard. The night settled over the kingdom like a velvet cloak, heavy yet comforting, drawing every living thing into a quieter rhythm. The air had cooled, but not harshly. It carried the scent of dew beginning to form upon grass and stone. The torches along the castle walls flickered steadily, their flames leaning toward the breeze, casting long, patient shadows across the courtyard. Katherine stepped softly into the courtyard, her slippers making no sound upon the worn flagstones. The hush of midnight suited her. Her thoughts were calm, her steps unhurried, her presence no more than another part of the night's stillness. She lifted her gaze to the sky, where the stars shone brightly now, unchallenged by the sun's glow. It felt as though the heavens had spilled countless drops of silver across a canvas of indigo. Fred was already there, seated on a low stone wall, his cloak wrapped loosely around his shoulders. His eyes were half closed, as though he had been listening to the silence itself. When Katherine approached, he smiled faintly and shifted slightly to make room beside him. "You walk as though the night belongs to you," Fred said, his voice low, meant not to disturb the serenity. Katherine sat beside him, tucking her shawl around herself. "Perhaps it belongs to us all," she replied softly, "and we are simply allowed to borrow its quiet for a little while." The courtyard lay open, framed by stone arches that caught the moonlight and softened it. A fountain murmured gently at its center, the water's voice even and steady, as though reciting a lullaby older than memory. Fireflies glided near the hedges, their glow faint yet tender, like secret promises whispered between shadows. Antonio entered not long after, carrying with him a lantern whose light barely disturbed the darkness. He set it down upon the edge of the fountain, where it mingled with the moon's glow and the stars reflected in the rippling water. His steps slowed as he looked around, his expression serene, as if he were greeting the night as one greets an old friend. "Does it not feel," Antonio murmured, seating himself across from them, "as though the world is gentlest when all else has gone to sleep?" Fred gave a thoughtful nod. "The day belongs to tasks and voices," he answered, "but the night belongs to silence, and silence has its own kind of wisdom." The three fell into quiet again, the stillness between their words as nourishing as speech. They breathed in the cool air, their lungs filling with the peace of it, their hearts easing into its rhythm. Somewhere distant, an owl called once, its note deep and rounded, and then the sound faded into the hush. Katherine leaned her elbows lightly upon her knees, gazing at the reflection of the stars in the fountain's surface. "It's as if the heavens stoop low to meet us here," she said. "Look, the stars resting upon the water, the moon bending to touch the stones." Antonio followed her gaze, his lips curving in agreement. "Yes, it is as though the night wishes to remind us we are not apart, but within it, woven into its fabric, as threads of gold are woven into cloth." A gentle breeze stirred then, carrying the faint rustle of leaves in the garden beyond the walls. The air smelled of roses closed for the night, of damp earth settling beneath dew, of smoke still faintly lingering from the hearths of the village below. It was a tapestry of scents, subtle but whole, each note blending into the next like a soft chord in a lullaby. Fred broke a sprig of rosemary from his cloak and rolled it gently between his fingers, letting its fragrance rise. "The simplest things," he said quietly, "become most precious when the world is hushed." Katherine rested her head against her hand, eyes drifting shut for a moment. "Perhaps that is why nights like this feel eternal," she whispered, "because they ask nothing of us but to be." Antonio opened his book once more, the lantern's glow brushing across the worn pages. He did not read in full, only let fragments slip into the air like drifting petals. Words of poets long past, verses about moonlight and stillness, about the quiet dignity of the earth. His voice was low, carrying no weight but calm, blending into the night as though it belonged there. Katherine and Fred listened, their bodies leaning slightly toward him, drawn not to the meaning of each word, but to the softness of the sound. The syllables carried the same rhythm as the fountain's murmur, steady, hypnotic, gentle. When Antonio closed the book again, no one hurried to speak. The silence that followed was as rich as the poetry itself. Their breaths were slow, their eyelids heavy, though no one sought to rise. They were content to sit, to be, to share the stillness without measure. Time seemed to soften around them, stretching and folding upon itself. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, though none of them noticed. The moon drifted higher, casting silver across their faces, but still they sat, quiet companions within the courtyard's embrace. At length, Fred stirred and stretched his arms with a lazy sigh. "Even rest has its own depth," he murmured, "as though we are being drawn into the very heart of peace." Catherine's smile was faint, drowsy. "Perhaps the heart of peace is not a place at all," she said, "but a moment such as this held without rush." Antonio rose at last, lifting the lantern in one hand. Its flame flickered softly, no brighter than the glow of a single star. "Then let us carry this peace with us," he said, his tone no louder than a breath. "Into our dreams." The three stood together, unhurried, their shadows stretching long across the stones. They passed through the archway slowly, as though reluctant to leave the night behind, yet knowing the quiet would follow them wherever they went. Inside the castle, the corridors were dim, lit only by the occasional torch that burned low, its flame more ember than fire. The stone walls seemed to breathe coolness, and their footsteps echoed softly, rhythmic and measured. They moved not as intruders of the night, but as guests, welcomed by its silence. At Catherine's chamber door, they paused. She turned to them with a look of gratitude, her eyes reflecting the lantern's flame. "Good night," she said simply, the words wrapping around them like a blanket. Fred bowed his head slightly. "May your dreams be as gentle as the stars." Antonio lifted the lantern in farewell. "And may peace linger with us until morning light." With that, they parted, each retreating into their own quiet space. Katherine lay upon her bed, the covers drawn lightly over her, her body sinking into the comfort of the mattress. The window beside her was open, allowing the silver glow of the moon to rest upon her pillow. Her breaths deepened, slow and calm. Fred settled in his chamber, the scent of rosemary still clinging to his cloak. He placed it by his bedside, closed his eyes, and felt the silence cradle him. Antonio placed his book upon a table, extinguished the lantern, and sat by the window for a while longer. He gazed at the night, the stars like lanterns suspended in eternity, until his eyelids grew heavy and he too sought rest. The courtyard stood empty, yet not alone. The fountain's murmur continued, the fireflies still drifted, and the moon's silver light washed every stone in gentleness. The kingdom slept, and in its dreams, it carried the peace of midnight forward. Chapter 8. The Quiet Before Dawn. The world was still wrapped in night when the first hints of dawn stirred, so faint they might have gone unnoticed. The stars still glittered brightly overhead, a river of silver stretching across the sky, but low on the horizon a softness had begun to bloom. A pale wash of blue brushed against the edge of darkness, so delicate it seemed like a dream dissolving into another dream. The castle lay quiet. Its towers stood dark against the heavens, their outlines softened by moonlight. Within its stone walls, the corridors were hushed, torches burning low. their flames little more than embers glowing in iron sconces. Doors were closed, chambers at rest, the kingdom still held in the embrace of slumber. Yet the air itself felt different now, still calm, still hushed, but carrying a promise. The kind of promise one feels before the first birds call, before the first golden beams slip across the earth. It was the promise of morning, though night still lingered in full. Katherine stirred before the rest, her eyes opening slowly as if she had been gently nudged by the hour itself. She lay for a time, watching the silver moonlight stretch across her chamber floor. Her breath rose and fell, calm and steady, the rhythm of sleep still clinging to her. But something drew her from bed, a quiet curiosity, a desire to witness what came just before the day. She wrapped herself in a soft cloak and slipped from her room, her steps slow, careful not to disturb the stillness. The stone beneath her feet was cool, and the corridors whispered faint echoes of her passing. At the courtyard door, she paused and let her hand rest upon the wooden frame, breathing in the cool air that drifted through the small gap. When she stepped outside, she found the world still cloaked in night, yet softer now than before. The stars seemed gentler, the moon lower, as though both were preparing to bow before the coming sun. The courtyard fountain sang on, but its sound felt rounder, deeper, carrying the weight of the hours that had passed. Katherine moved to sit by the fountain's edge. She drew her cloak tighter and gazed upward, her eyes tracing the constellations she had learned as a child. Her lips moved silently, naming each pattern in turn. The hunter, the swan, the crown. They seemed closer than ever, as though leaning down to keep her company. Fred arrived not long after, rubbing sleep from his eyes, his hair tousled, his cloak hastily thrown over his tunic. He chuckled softly when he saw her. "Even before dawn, you seek the quiet," he said, settling beside her on the stone rim. Katherine smiled faintly. "It feels like the world is holding its breath," she whispered. "I didn't want to miss it." Fred followed her gaze to the horizon, where the faintest glow was just beginning to spread. It was not yet color, not yet light, only the softest brushing of gray against indigo. He nodded, his own voice dropping to match the hush of the moment. "It is a gentle waiting, isn't it? As if all the earth knows something is about to change." Antonio joined them a little later, carrying his lantern, though its light was hardly needed now. He placed it down by the fountain, where it flickered weakly against the greater glow of moon and stars. His eyes were heavy with sleep, but his expression carried quiet joy. "You've both stolen the hour from the night," Antonio said softly, seating himself across from them. "It's the most fragile time of all, and the most beautiful." They sat together, saying little, letting silence stretch wide around them. The air carried the cool damp of night grass, tinged with the faint scent of earth preparing to warm beneath the sun. A breeze rustled the ivy along the walls, its whispering sound like fabric brushing softly against stone. In the distance, the first bird called, a single note tentative yet clear. Then another joined, and another, until a scattered chorus spread across the fields. The sound was not yet full morning song, but the first test of voices, like musicians tuning their instruments before the melody begins. Katherine closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. "It feels like the kingdom itself is waking," she murmured, "not in haste, not with alarm, but with tenderness." Antonio smiled, leaning back upon his hands. "The sun is a patient guest. It never knocks loudly at the door, but waits until the world is ready to welcome it." Fred plucked a leaf from the rosemary hedge nearby, rolling it between his fingers. "And when it comes, it brings warmth that lingers long after it's gone. Like friendship." Their words faded into quiet again, replaced by the slow bloom of light upon the horizon. What had been pale gray deepened into silver, then shifted to the faintest shade of rose. The color spread like watercolor across the sky, touching the edges of clouds, softening the sharp lines of the hills beyond. The moon, still visible, seemed reluctant to leave, but its glow paled gently, allowing dawn to take its place. The stars dimmed one by one, fading into the vastness like candles blown out softly. In the courtyard, the fountain reflected the changing sky, its rippling surface catching the rose and silver and scattering them into 1,000 shifting fragments. The lantern Antonio had carried looked faint now, its flame no match for the growing light. Katherine rested her chin upon her knees, her eyes heavy yet unwilling to close. "It feels like a gift," she whispered. "This moment when both night and day exist together." Fred nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It is the kingdom's gentlest hour, when shadows and light hold hands." Antonio reached for his book, but this time he did not open it. Instead, he let it rest upon his lap, his eyes drinking in the sight before him. "Some things," he said softly, "are better remembered without words." The three remained together as the sky brightened, each of them quiet, each carried deeper into calm by the slow unfolding of dawn. Their breaths synchronized without intention, their shoulders lowered, their minds softened into ease. At last, the first true rays of the sun touched the horizon. They spilled across the fields in golden threads, illuminating the rooftops of the village below, setting the castle stones aglow as though polished by unseen hands. The courtyard seemed to sigh with relief, its shadows retreating gently, its fountains sparkling with new brilliance. The birdsong grew fuller, swelling into a melody that wove itself through every corner of the kingdom. Katherine, Fred, and Antonio did not speak. They simply watched, their hearts steady, their minds quiet, their bodies folded into the embrace of morning. When the sun had risen enough to crown the castle towers in gold, Katherine stood slowly. "Shall we carry this peace into the day?" she asked, her voice low but sure. Fred smiled, his eyes reflecting the dawn. "Yes, let us carry it, like a flame that does not fade." Antonio lifted the lantern, now dim beside the sun, and nodded. "For even when light surrounds us, it is good to keep a spark close." Together, they left the courtyard, their steps unhurried, their bodies lightened by the peace of the hour. Behind them, the fountain sang brighter, the ivy rustled with new life, and the sky above glowed with the promise of day. And so the kingdom, golden in its first light, welcomed another morning, wrapped not in urgency, but in gentleness. Chapter 9, Morning's Golden Embrace. The sun rose higher, though still gentle, a soft golden orb stretching its warmth across the valley. Its light spread slowly, as though it wished not to startle the land but to awaken it with kindness. The shadows of the night retreated into corners and hollows, making way for beams that kissed rooftops, fields, and riverbanks with a tender glow. From the castle's courtyard, Katherine, Fred, and Antonio watched the world ease into its morning rhythm. Where once the air had been damp with night, it now held the freshness of early day, carrying the sense of dew on grass and herbs stirred awake by sunlight. The village below stirred gradually. First came the distant creak of shutters opening, followed by the faint sounds of voices greeting the morning. Smoke rose from chimneys one by one, thin and blue at first, then fuller as hearths were stoked for bread and broth. Chickens began their soft clucking, while the low hum of a cow drifted from a nearby pasture. Katherine leaned her elbows upon the courtyard wall, gazing outward. "Every sound is soft," she murmured, "as though the world is careful not to disturb what peace remains from the night." Fred nodded, his eyes following the thin ribbon of river that shimmered in the light. It is a kingdom of gentle waking. No clamor, no haste, only the steady return of life. Antonio, ever thoughtful, opened his book at last, though he did not read. Instead, he slipped a sprig of rosemary from his pocket and pressed it between the pages. "Each day begins as a story," he said quietly, "and this morning writes in gold." The three walked together through the castle's garden, where roses still held drops of dew that sparkled like tiny jewels in the light. Lavender released its fragrance when brushed by their cloaks, and the soft hum of bees joined the morning chorus. The garden paths wound in curves, leading them toward an archway draped in ivy. Beyond it, the world opened again into rolling fields. The meadows stretched wide, their grasses shining silver at the tips where dew lingered. Birds darted low across them, chasing insects awakened by the warmth. In the distance, shepherds guided their flocks with low whistles, the sound carrying across the hills like music. Katherine paused, her eyes soft. "It feels as though even the fields breathe," she said. "Each blade of grass moves as one. Each tree bends with the same rhythm." Fred plucked a stalk of wheat and turned it between his fingers. "The kingdom is alive, not just with people, but with every small thing that stirs." Antonio smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "And we are but part of its great harmony." The path they took led downward, toward the village itself. By the time they arrived, the square was filled with the gentle hum of morning. Merchants arranged baskets of fruit and herbs, their voices low but cheerful as they exchanged greetings. Children carried loaves from the bakery to doorsteps, their laughter soft as bells. A blacksmith swept his shop front, the scrape of broom bristles steady and rhythmic, not harsh. The fountain in the square sparkled in the sun, its waters brighter now, scattering gold where the light caught. Villagers gathered around it, dipping buckets, sharing a word or two before returning to their tasks. The lanterns that had burned through the night were now extinguished, their glass still warm, their work complete until evening returned. Katherine, Fred, and Antonio paused at the fountain, watching as the water fell in arcs of silver and gold. They drank from cupped hands, the coolness refreshing against the growing warmth. "It is a blessing," Katherine whispered, "to know that each day begins in such peace." Fred leaned upon the fountain's edge, closing his eyes, "and to carry that peace with us as the day unfolds." Antonio dipped his hand into the pool and let the water drip slowly back, each droplet sparkling like a jewel. Even the smallest things shine when touched by morning light. From the bakery came the scent of fresh bread, carried by the breeze. Isolde, the baker's wife, emerged with a tray of loaves, their crusts golden, their steam rising in little curls. She greeted them with a smile, placing a loaf into Katherine's hands. "To begin the day well," she said softly. They broke bread together beneath the elm in the square. The loaf was warm, its crust crackling gently as it tore, its inside soft as clouds. They ate slowly, savoring the simple gift, their voices quiet between bites. The square filled gradually with more life, but never in haste. Farmers arrived with carts of vegetables, their wheels creaking softly over cobblestones. A musician plucked a lute at the inn's doorway, his tune gentle, more like a hum than a song. A painter set up her easel near the fountain, her brush dipping slowly, patiently, into shades of gold and green. Katherine rested her back against the elm, her hands folded loosely in her lap. "Every moment feels painted," she said, her eyes half closed, "as though we walk within a living canvas." Fred tilted his head, listening to the lute's notes as they blended with the fountain's murmur. "The kingdom itself composes its music." Antonio leaned forward, his fingers tracing the grain of the bread crust. "And in its music, we find rest." The hours moved gently, and the sun climbed higher, its warmth spreading but never harsh. Shadows shortened, and the air carried the sweet scent of blossoming vines from the hillsides. Everywhere, the kingdom seemed bathed in calm, the kind of calm that did not press itself upon the senses, but invited itself quietly into the heart. Children's laughter rose, not in sharp bursts, but in soft streams as they played with hoops and wooden toys. The smith hammered gently at a horseshoe, each strike steady, almost like a heartbeat. The painter's brush swayed across her canvas, capturing the light as it moved across the fountain spray. And all the while, Katherine, Fred, and Antonio lingered, by the elm, by the fountain, among the villagers who lived with such unhurried joy. They felt themselves part of the morning, part of the peace that threaded through every stone, every leaf, every sound. At last, when the sun stood high enough to drape the castle towers in full brilliance, Katherine rose. She looked at Fred and Antonio, her expression soft, her voice calm. "Let us carry this golden morning with us. For though the hours will change, the peace we hold now can remain." Fred nodded, brushing crumbs from his cloak. "Peace is not the gift of the hour," he said quietly. "It is the gift we choose to keep." Antonio closed his book with care, tying its leather strap. "And perhaps," he added, "it is the true treasure of the Golden Kingdom." Together, they stepped once more into the slow rhythm of the day, their hearts light, their minds untroubled, their bodies carried forward on the quiet stream of time. The fountain sang, the lute strummed, the villagers hummed, and above it all, the sun shone steady, as if blessing the kingdom with endless calm. And so, morning in the Golden Kingdom embraced them all, not with urgency, but with warmth, weaving a memory of peace to be carried into every hour that followed. Chapter 10, Twilight's Gentle Song. As the day stretched into its later hours, the Golden Kingdom softened once more. The sun, which had poured warmth over fields and rivers, began its slow descent, spilling a gentler light across the land. Shadows grew long and graceful, flowing from towers, trees, and hillsides like velvet drapery. The air cooled, carrying with it the fragrance of meadow flowers closing for the night, mingled with the faint spice of wood smoke as villagers lit their hearths for supper. Birds that had sung through the morning now quieted, their wings folding as they settled into nests among the castle eaves and forest boughs. From the high courtyard, Katherine, Fred, and Antonio looked upon the scene. The kingdom appeared almost to shimmer, as though caught between waking and dream. Roofs glowed in the last gold of the day, while the river reflected streaks of rose and violet, a mirror for the fading sky. "How soft it becomes," Katherine murmured, her voice calm, as though not to disturb the stillness. The kingdom exhales at twilight. Fred rested his hands on the stone wall, watching as shepherds guided their flocks homeward, the faint bells on the sheep chiming in the distance. "The land knows when it is time to rest," he said. "And so do we." Antonio opened his book only to close it again, his palm resting on the leather cover. "Some stories are better felt than read," he said with a faint smile. "And this evening is its own story." The three descended to the gardens, where lanterns were being lit one by one. Each small flame glowed warmly within glass, casting pools of amber along the paths. The roses, now in shadow, seemed deeper in color, while the lavender gave its last sigh of fragrance into the cooling air. Bees had gone, but moths stirred softly, drifting like pale petals from flower to flower. They walked slowly, their footsteps gentle against the cobblestones. The castle's tall windows caught the sky's reflection, glowing pink and gold before fading into soft gray. Inside, servants moved quietly, preparing tables with bread, fruit, and warm broth. The sound of a lute drifted from the great hall, its notes low and slow, filling the air with a melody as soothing as a heartbeat. Katherine paused to listen, her eyes half closing. "Music carries the soul into evening," she whispered. Fred nodded. "It smooths the edges of the day, softening what was sharp, quieting what was restless." Antonio hummed along, his voice no more than a murmur, blending with the lute. "It is the kingdom's lullaby." Later, they dined together in the hall, though the meal was simple. Warm bread, ripe pears, and a fragrant stew that filled the air with gentle spice. Candles flickered in tall holders, their flames steady and calm. The great hearth glowed with embers, casting a deep warmth into the room, the crackle of fire joining the lute's soft song. Conversation was unhurried. Villagers at nearby tables spoke in low voices, sharing the day's smallest joys: fields tilled, cloth woven, loaves baked. Nothing urgent, nothing heavy, only the lightest threads of daily life. Katherine listened with quiet delight, her eyes bright in the glow. Fred shared a few kind words with an old farmer, while Antonio traced patterns into the condensation on his cup, thoughtful and serene. After supper, they stepped outside once more. Twilight deepened into night, the sky now a canvas of deep indigo, scattered with the first stars. The moon rose slow and round, its silver glow softening the edges of towers and fields. The fountain in the village square shimmered in its light, its spray catching like threads of silver silk. The square itself was calmer now. Children, weary from play, rested in their mothers' arms. Merchants drew shutters across their stalls, the sound of wood on wood echoing gently. Lanterns glowed in every doorway, casting golden halos onto the cobblestones. The village moved toward sleep, one breath at a time. Katherine leaned against the elm tree at the edge of the square. "How safe it feels," she said softly, "as though night itself is a blanket drawn over us." Fred tilted his head back, gazing at the stars. "Each light above is a guardian," he replied. "The sky watches over the kingdom." Antonio clasped his hands behind his back, his gaze steady on the moon. "And in its watch we find peace." They lingered in silence, listening to the night's gentle sounds. The distant call of an owl, the rustle of leaves in a breeze, the soft trickle of the fountain's water. The world seemed to hum in a slower rhythm now, a rhythm that soothed and stilled. When the hour grew later, the three returned to the castle. Their chambers were warmed by small fires that glowed like embers from a dragon's breath. Gentle, protective, steady. Katherine placed her cloak upon a chair, its fabric carrying the faint scent of lavender from the gardens. Fred sat by the window, watching as mist began to gather on the hills. Antonio set his book upon a table, though once again he did not open it. Instead, he spoke, his voice a quiet murmur. The kingdom itself dreams now. Its fields rest, its rivers soften, its people lie in comfort. And tomorrow, it will awaken once more. Katherine lay upon her bed, her eyes drifting closed as she listened. Fred's hand rested on the windowsill, his breathing even, his posture calm. Antonio moved to the hearth, watching the flames flicker lower until they too grew drowsy. Silence settled, but not the silence of emptiness. It was a full silence, woven with the threads of peace, carrying the weight of a day lived gently and completely. The castle walls held it, the fields carried it, the stars blessed it. And so the golden kingdom slept, beneath the glow of the moon, under the blanket of twilight song. It rested whole and untroubled. Its people dreamed of mornings yet to come, of bread and laughter, of rivers and stars, of harmony that endured. Within this dream, Katherine, Fred, and Antonio drifted too, into quiet visions where peace never faltered, and where each moment, like the kingdom itself, shone with golden calm.